Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay up in the back? Well, I'm overwhelmed with the size of this audience, but I don't think it's for me. I think it's for this moment in history. And that's what I want to talk about, is the moment that we're in. And so I'm going to begin with another person who was very interested in moments and history, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche. So this will be the epigraph to this entire lecture. Insanity in individuals is somewhat rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule. I used to think that this was Nietzsche either being funny or witty or outrageous, philosophizing with a hammer to make himself be heard. But the older I get, the more it looks like plain common sense, verified by experience every day and mostly by the experience of the moment we're living in. Especially today, and when I say today, I mean literally this day in January 2017, when just 48 hours from now, a man with no experience in politics or public service of any kind, a reality TV star, a real estate speculator whose history of shady dealings, tax evasion, and personal immorality is, so far as I know, unrivaled in American history, and that is a very high bar to raise. He is going to be taking the oath of office to become the most powerful man on the planet that we live in. He will be asked on Friday to take the oath of office and to raise his right hand and solemnly swear to uphold a document which, so far as I can tell, he has never read, namely the Constitution of the United States. And I'm sure if he's raising one hand, the other hand will have its fingers crossed. But maybe he won't even raise his hand. Maybe he'll raise his toupee. No president in American history has ever taken office with such low approval ratings. Usually when you win an election in the US, it's because a majority of people voted for you, and so your ratings are just above 50%. But no president has ever taken office with approval ratings of the sort that Trump is burdened with, as well as so many scandals, so many investigations into collusion with long-standing enemies of the nation. Defeated by 3 million votes in the popular election, Trump assumes office by virtue of a strange American institution called the Electoral College, a relic of American slavery, which was designed to count non-voting slaves as 2/3 of a person in order to bolster the power of slave-owning states. There's something quite appropriate about the Electoral College deciding this. By the way, it's the second time in the 21st century it's happened. The first time was when George W. Bush was awarded the election, and it was a much closer election, though. So it's no wonder, I think, that in this moment it's become commonplace to suggest that America has gone crazy. This is just a small montage. I could have assembled 50 more headlines of this sort. So for the majority of Americans who did not vote for Trump, the events of the days since November 8, 2016 have seemed as if what James Joyce had Stephen Dedalus say in Ulysses, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to escape. It's as if that nightmare has come true. And as Stephen Dedalus said, very difficult to wake up from it, maybe impossible. It's a reality that will not go away and has only just begun. Like another nightmare of the 21st century, September 11th, 2001, it marks a historical epoch, underscoring another point that Nietzsche makes in his famous aphorism, not about collective groups like groups, parties, nations, but also epochs, a temporal dimension. Most of the time, we don't live in history. I know I don't. Most of the time, I live by the clock that tells me when to get up, go to work, go to sleep, have meals. But every once in a while, time seems to expand and dilate and produce something that we call an epoch, a turning point. So I think it's very easy to predict that the moment we are now marking will be known as the era of the onset of Trumpism, the beginning of this, although there has been a long history of its development, which will now come into view. If it had been a different result on November 8th, we wouldn't even be thinking about this. And by the way, I'm totally surprised to be here talking about this. A year ago, when Jean-François Stézac invited me, I thought I would be giving a harmless academic paper, so you'll have to bear with me. But this is an epoch that some people saw coming a long way off. It was foretold as a danger that's built into American democracy and perhaps built into democracy itself. I think it's not just a bad election result, but it's a very dangerous moment for democracy. And it was predicted almost 100 years ago by one of the great American journalists, H.L. Mencken, who had the following thing to say. As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be occupied by a downright fool and complete narcissistic moron. July 26th, 1920. Mencken's prophetic words have now been turned into an actual image, projected by a real person in the world. And so there's his words appearing once again. I'm not sure if they appeared in the Baltimore Sun as they did in 1920. Throughout the long 18-month process of falling into this nightmare, we've been partially comforted, I think. I was comforted by Mencken's characterization of this imaginary president as a fool and narcissistic moron. Perhaps he would be as bad as Warren G. Harding, the totally ineffectual 19th century president who apparently didn't show up for work very often. We had become accustomed and lulled into a false sense of security by seeing Trump as nothing but a clown who had no chance of winning the presidency. And I think Trump himself was astonished. He had no speech ready on election night. He really didn't know what to do because, as you will recall, no one thought he could win. All the experts were stymied. So, unfortunately, the only part of Mencken's portrayal that now seems accurate is the charge of narcissism, which is being confirmed every day by Twitter feeds. But the part that's not true, unfortunately, Trump is neither a fool nor a moron. He is, as Mitt Romney noted, the previous Republican candidate for president in 2012, Mitt Romney called him what he really is, a clever, unscrupulous con man, a fraud and a fake who presents a clear and present danger both to the American economy and its relationships with other nations. Since the election, as you may know, Mitt Romney has undergone a conversion experience. And he has led the way for the opportunists in the Republican Party who see a chance to fulfill their various agendas. So Romney, in I think the most humiliating moment, a former presidential candidate who won something like 48% of the American electorate, became a celebrity apprentice and went to Trump Tower to kiss the ring of the new sovereign, to have a conversation and be tested, and then was told, sorry, we can't use you. Perhaps the most humiliating moment for an American politician, and richly deserved. I was so happy when he did not get a cabinet position. Nietzsche's aphorism that I began with, about collective insanity, has a long pedigree of historical precedents. It's not as if he was the first person to ever think of this. So I want to go back to the first democracy, Athens, and the line of Solon, one of the great Athenian statesmen, who noted that a single Athenian is a wily fox, but a group of Athenians is a flock of sheep. And in Germany, 19th century, Schiller's remark, every man seen as an individual is tolerably shrewd and sensible. See them in corpore, and you will instantly find a fool. And I want to emphasize this. If there are Trump supporters here, I am not saying that you are crazy. Individually, I'm sure you're just as sane as I am, which is, moderately neurotic. And I think that's, Freud showed us long ago that that's basically the nature of the human condition. We're all screwed up a little bit. But this is not about that. This is about what happens when a mass begins to move and act. We see it most kind of vividly in crowd situations, when crowds stampede or panic or become enthusiastic over something, and they act crazy. So this is about crowd psychology, not about, I'm not accusing any particular Trump supporter of being crazy. Plato saw this also when he characterized democracy as especially vulnerable to mass insanity. He called it a ship of fools in which the captain is chosen not because he knows how to sail a ship, but because he's good at flattery. He's good at attracting attention. And Solon and Schiller express basically the same idea. But Nietzsche refines their observation by putting it in the modern terms not of folly and foolishness, but the more emphatic and dangerous terms of insanity. And when I say insanity, I'm not going to get very technical about psychiatric definitions. I'm thinking of a legal meaning for insanity. Legal insanity is when you are a danger to yourself and others. And I think at this point, the American nation maybe have formed itself into a danger to itself and certainly a danger to others. Nietzsche then not only goes beyond folly to insanity, but he refines the observation by historicizing it in relation to that momentous event, the epoch. So the question is, what is different about our epoch? How is our collective insanity different from the age-old tendency of human beings to do crazy things when they get together in groups, parties, and nations? What makes this historical nightmare worse than the one envisioned by Mencken in 1920? The answer, I think, is that the consequences of collective irrationality, folly, and delusion are no longer confined to small city-states like Athens, or even relatively powerful nations like the United Kingdom, whose recent Brexit gave a foretaste of the Trump election. When the world's most powerful nation goes crazy, the consequences are global. And this is perhaps nowhere to be seen more clearly than in the absolute silence about the greatest challenge facing the world community in the foreseeable future, namely climate change. The issue, if you followed the American election, never came up in the debates. The phrase climate change never was uttered. It received very little coverage in the media, but it's the most important issue, in my view, for the world. Second place would be terror, the war on terror, the disintegration of the Middle East, the emergence of rogue states and failed states all over the planet. But the long-range great threat to humanity is that we will foul our own nest and ruin the planet. Never came up, not an issue. So climate change is a hard sell, I understand, to people who do not read newspapers and pay attention to nothing but, say, right-wing talk radio, or to Donald Trump, who said, climate change is a hoax. It was invented by the Chinese, who want to invest in solar technology. So one would think that when 195 countries send their representatives to Paris, and they come to an agreement that climate change is real and must be addressed, one would think that the issue is, as we say, a no-brainer. But Trump is a climate change denier, and he has now nominated a fossil fuel lobbyist to be head of the Environmental Protection Agency and promised to tear up the Paris Agreement as a bad deal for America. So this suggests that Nietzsche's aphorism needs to be further amended. It's not just groups, parties, and nations that are in danger from this epoch of collective madness, but the species that we belong to, the human species. Of course, if my dark prophecy is correct, there will be outposts of civilization, gated communities for those rich enough to protect themselves. Sorry, I missed my Brexit moment. It's also, everybody could see the insanity coming. It was like a prelude to the psychotic break of November back in June. So suppose I'm right, and climate change does do what most scientists predict, raise the sea levels, destroy the food cycle, make large portions of the earth really uninhabitable. What will that mean? And I think it won't mean, probably Switzerland will be all right. If I can get Swiss citizenship at that time, I will apply for it. Because I think Switzerland, in a way, is a kind of a foretaste of what the gated community of the future might look like. So Trump's grandchildren will be all right, and just as the wealthy citizens of Mumbai in India are today. You can go to Mumbai and stay in the Trump Tower. Of course, in the alley behind it, you will see scenes like this. The rest of humanity, the great majority, can expect to join the huddled figures in the foreground of this image. But I want to turn now to a question that I imagine it's been on your mind. When I talk about madness and insanity, and when Nietzsche did it, is this just a rhetorical tool? Is it a kind of polemical instrument? Am I using this language just as an insult to Trump and to the Trump supporters as a collective, saying things like, well, you're crazy, foolish, ignorant, a lunatic, an idiot, a moron, out of your mind, deranged, deluded? Or does it have an analytic potential? A style of thinking and feeling that's resistant to persuasion but might be susceptible of understanding. It's one of the characteristics of an epoch like this that it's going to be very difficult, I think, to distinguish between rational analysis and polemic. It may, in fact, be the case that there are times in history, and this is one of them, when reason and outrage have to converge. And the whole liberal style of calm deliberation and the comfort of long views will seem somewhat inadequate. My colleague at University of Chicago, Lauren Berlant, has diagnosed our moment as what she calls flailing between genres, as if we don't even know how to narrate our present moment. Marx thought that history could repeat itself, as he said in the 18th Brumaire, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. But what if a moment in history feels like tragedy and farce at the same time? To be adequate to such a moment, I think inevitably we have to flail about a bit, to be experimental with our genres, and to remember that flailing is not only a metaphor for aimless thrashing about, but an actual tool of the harvest, an instrument for separating the wheat from the chaff, for threshing as well as thrashing. And that's why I've adopted as my critical flail in this essay the discourse of madness and psychosis, and more specifically an American psychosis peculiar to the history of our nation. As a student of visual culture, I see the category of collective psychosis not just as a label, but as an optic, what Ludwig Wittgenstein called a mode of seeing as, or aspect seeing. Like any optic, it helps you to see some things clearly and will also be vulnerable to blind spots. For this moment, though, I think it's a productive framework for analyzing this shocking and crazy moment in history. This is especially true when, as I've tried to suggest, the language of insanity is everywhere in the vernacular, everyday language of American politics and, for that matter, world politics. It's also, the idea of collective madness, just to remind you, is a fundamental postulate of the founder of psychoanalysis. And I think here it's necessary to quote Freud, word for word. The contrast between individual psychology and social or group psychology, which at first glance seems to be full of significance, loses a great deal of its sharpness when examined more closely. It's true that individual psychology is concerned with the individual man and explores the paths by which he seeks to find satisfaction for his instincts. But only rarely and under certain exceptional conditions is individual psychology in a position to disregard the relations of this individual to others. In the individual's mental life, someone else is invariably involved as a model, an object, a helper, as an opponent. And so from the very first, individual psychology is at the same time social psychology in this extended but entirely justifiable sense of the words. Now, Freud thought of the relation between individual and collective psychology as a kind of series of concentric circles, radiating outward from the individual to the family, and then later to larger groups such as tribes, ethnic groups, and finally to the species itself. But Freud's main effort was to trace the influence of the smallest of these groups, namely the family, in producing individual disorders. So the task of our imagining now is to think Freud backwards, to turn him upside down, and to ask the question, how is it possible that a group of otherwise sensible individuals can go mad when they get together, and especially in a democratic polity? What is it that turns wily Athenians, to remind you of Solon, to turn wily Athenians into a flock of sheep? And the only way I can answer this question is to continue the metaphor. A clever and unscrupulous shepherd who understands collective psychology, who has perhaps, I don't think he reads much, but he intuited Freud's aphorism and knows how to exploit it. In short, the best interlocutor for a psychotic is a con man, a demagogue, someone who is able to lie constantly and to keep a whole populace off balance and make all authority seem to stem from whatever he is thinking and saying at any given moment. The con man listens closely to his mark. He doesn't just talk. He mirrors back the delusions that he hears coming from the mob or the crowd. And I don't know, most people, most of my liberal friends thought that Trump was a clown because all they read were the sound bites and the tweets, the one-liners. But remember, Trump drew enormous crowds. Thousands of people came out to hear him. He is a fantastic entertainer. If you took the trouble, as I did, to listen to an entire speech, he had a magical technique of starting out extremely rational, but listening to the response of the crowd, listening to what they would cheer for, and also listening to their silences. He is a maestro of demagoguery, of conning an audience by just the way a con man works with an individual. They listen. What will get to this person? So the mirroring back of the crowd is what Trump is a master at. He feeds on paranoia, anger, resentment, makes promises that appeal to the victim's fantasies, like, I'm going to make America great again, and amplifies their fear and hatred of others, Mexican rapists, Muslims, and above all, their fellow Americans, especially the experts, the snotty liberal elites who don't respect them. And then finally, the media who are bringing all of this to you, the media who are lying constantly. So in order to understand how Trump did it, you really have to listen to a whole speech. The sound bites and the tweets make him sound eccentric and crazy, but they are only the tip of the iceberg. So when did this danger arise? I think it's not a new phenomenon. That's why I begin with Solon, with Plato, to remind you that the whole history of democracy itself has always been alert to the power of collective insanity, collective psychosis. Think about what democratic theory really amounts to. It's grounded in a fiction, public opinion, the will of the people. The public can't have an opinion. I have an opinion, you have an opinion. How does a group come to have an opinion? And how do we measure it? Public opinion was constantly being recycled, and it produces a feedback loop. That's why polling is such an important part of what Trump does. Trump looks at the polls every day, and he must be, this is why he's becoming so defensive right now, because the polls are not looking very good. So democracy has always struggled to build in safeguards against what it knew was its own Achilles heel, that is, against collective psychoses, which lead a majority or a strong minority, as in our case, to do something destructive to the body politic itself. So the very idea of democracy qualified by the rule of law, by a constitution, all that testifies to the need to restrain popular passions and limit the power of majorities, and especially to limit the power of the sovereign. In the US Constitution, the division of powers between legislative, judicial, and executive branches is already a kind of allegory for a balanced individual mentality, capable of restraining itself by passing laws and then obeying them, judging for itself whether those laws are being obeyed, and carrying them out with what a neuropsychologist would call the executive function of the brain. So collective psychology is a real thing, and the entire history of democratic theory has implicitly acknowledged it. So it's exactly this threat, this ever-present danger to democracy that led Winston Churchill to declare democracy is the worst political arrangement we know of, except, he said, for all the others. But there are plenty of examples of the others, and we're already seeing many more of them around the world. Failed states, rogue states, states in which democracy is unthinkable. So it's important to note here that the potential for collective madness is not just confined to political movements that you happen to disagree with. It's not that I'm saying, because I lost this election, the other side is crazy. That's not the point. We're all involved in forms of collective consciousness, and we're all subject to forms of groupthink. In fact, it starts with the family. We learn how to think by finding out what counts as thinking. And certainly, a lot of people thought America went crazy in 2008. Remember that? There was something completely irrational about the wild, unrealistic hopes that surrounded the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Despite the fact that Obama will probably be remembered as one of the coolest, most rational presidents in US history, while Trump is widely derided as a demagogue and a huckster. Obama's election raised hopes globally, just as Trump's raised terrible fears globally. In a way, it's like a bipolar cycle. Mania, enthusiasm, exaggerated hopes and fantasies, and on the other hand, something just the opposite of that. I'm showing you here Shepard Fairey's famous poster of Obama from 2008, which was done in the style of Russian propaganda posters from the 1920s, the Soviet era. And it's been recycled. I don't know who did this, but now we have this answer. And as I said, the style of Shepard Fairey's image is drawn from Soviet revolutionary iconography. quite clearly comes out of things like this, same color scheme, same kind of solarized palette. So this suggests that both Obama and Trump are something like revolutionary figures, one in the name of hope, change, a future, the other in something much more dangerous and dark. So one would have to say that at the very least, American political culture doesn't just have two parties. It is structured around what psychiatrists would call a bipolar alternation of hope and fear, manic euphoria and depressive rage. Obama's American dream was transformed in a single day into Trump's American nightmare. That's why every 4 years in American politics, the predictable campaign slogan is reactionary. Throw the bums out, change that we can believe in, drain the swamp, and what do we have to lose? The basic American political instinct might be seen as a blind faith in change, with little curiosity about the actual nature of the change. So if you want to run for president, the best strategy is to run against the US government, against Washington. It's the most durable American political strategy we know. As Ronald Reagan put it, government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And that got him 8 years as the president. In this particular election, the default hostility to the central government was augmented by another familiar staple of American collective psychosis, namely racism and xenophobia, the fear of other people. Trump gained prominence in the first place by cynically exploiting the slanderous lie that Barack Obama was an illegal immigrant, not an American citizen, and that he was probably a secret Muslim. Not that he was alone in this. The modern Republican Party's Southern strategy of using white nationalist race hatred as a source of political power had prepared the way for Trump. Throughout Obama's 8 years in office, a steady stream of racist caricatures had circulated on the internet and Fox News, portraying the White House lawn first as a watermelon patch, when Michelle Obama decided to do urban gardening on the South Lawn to try to set a good example for mothers of America and their fathers. It was portrayed as the watermelon patch, which is a sign of negritude in the US, was coming. Or this kind of thing, our money is going to be worthless, it's going to be Obama bucks. Obama's name, in fact, became a kind of slogan in itself, so that Obamacare, when polls are taken to say, are you in favor of the president's health care program, when it's called the Affordable Care Act, a large majority of Americans think it's a great idea. When it's called Obamacare, the ratings go way down. The most egregious form of this, and a place where the unconscious of the Republican Party was really revealed, was in the attempt to confuse Barack Hussein Obama with Osama bin Laden. As you notice, the names resonate with one another, so that on the day that Osama bin Laden was killed, this was the graphic on Fox News. I'm not kidding. Somebody typing that out said, and it's a kind of, I mean, Freud would know what to say about this, right? Obama bin Laden dead. And the infection of this was so much that a kind of hapless Canadian broadcaster, anchorwoman, fell into this particular moment.
Or been heard about how Obama was killed and what led to the American forces finding out where he was. It started when Obama took office. He directed the head of the CIA to make killing Obama their #1 priority. Back in August, they got a possible lead on where Obama might be hiding. He was located, possibly, they believed at that time, in a compound deep within Pakistan.
So the Obama caricatures became so egregious that they began to even deconstruct themselves, as they did in this wonderful New Yorker cover from the summer of 2008, portraying Obama as a Muslim and Michelle Obama as a Black Panther revolutionary, with a portrait in the Oval Office of Osama bin Laden and the American flag burning in the fireplace. This was what I want to call a meta-caricature, a specific kind of meta-picture in which you take a previous caricature and you make fun of that caricature. Very interesting device in satire. It's a secondary satire on the patent ridiculousness and fraudulence of the Republican effort to undermine him. And for a kind of comprehensive mashup of the attacks on Obama in roughly 60 seconds. Here we go.
Party March on Washington, D.C. Hi, I'm Phil the Flag Guy, here from the International House of Flammable Flags. And if you like our flammable flag, you'll love our anti-Obama placards and signs. Why hassle with messy artwork, impossible spelling, and those darn splinters? We got Obama as Hitler, Obama as Stalin, Obama as the Joker, Obama with the Joker's face on Hitler's body, and Nancy Pelosi as the Crypt Keeper. Perfect for Halloween. Place an order of $50 or more and receive this handsome Glenn Beck nutcase. That's the International House of Flammable Flags.
Flammable flags, we light up your life.
America really is an exceptional country, I have to say. So these caricatures of Obama, while they did fire up what's now being called the alt-right and the white nationalists, didn't seem to have very much effect because they were so transparently false. And in fact, Obama is leaving office as one of the most popular presidents in American history. His ratings are nearly 60%, unheard of. The outgoing president is always suffering from fatigue and popularity decline, but Obama is not. In fact, there's been a lot of weeping and nostalgia for the last year, saying, you know, we finally had a reasonably rational human being as president. The caricatures of Trump, what about them? They also, I think, were powerless. They had little effect, but for exactly the opposite reason. And that's because they were so transparently true. One way to immunize yourself against caricature is to be a caricature, behave as a caricature in the first place. And as usual, it was the cartoonists themselves who realized this. So you get a cartoon like this. The cartoonist's wife is coming in, stop. That Trump cartoon you came up with this morning, it just happened. Shrewd cartoonists realized that, like the mainstream media, they were caught in an impossible dilemma. Here's one agonizing over it. If I cartoon about Trump, he wins. It feeds him, feeds his ego, and feeds his popularity. Because the cartoonist is dismissed as one of those elite liberal snobs, and the image is taken as an attack on the people who have already invested their passion in the figure of Trump. So it's very, very difficult to produce an effective caricature of Trump. And I could go through a lot of them. And for instance, Doonesbury completely failed. He tried using the fist, a metonymy, part for whole. And a lot of cartoonists tried using the hair because that's the most prominent feature. All to no effect. Because, as I said, there's something about Trump that's already a caricature, and I think he knows it. It's part of what being a reality TV star involves. So here he is providing a caricature of himself.
Trump facing new criticism for something he did on the campaign trail last night in South Carolina while defending his debunked claim that he saw thousands of Muslims celebrate the collapse of the Twin Towers here in New York. He appeared to mock a reporter with a disability. Take a look.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said. This is 14 years ago. They didn't do a retraction.
So how do you caricature that? I mean, Alec Baldwin, if you watch Saturday Night Live compulsively, as I do, it's beginning harder and harder to tell the difference between Alec Baldwin and the person who he's imitating. But the most egregious act of bad behavior, how do you produce critical humor out of someone who brags about getting away with sexual assault because they're a celebrity and nobody dares to complain? Here's that incredible moment.
It's 2005. Donald Trump pays a visit to the set of Days of Our Lives.
Hello, how are you? Hi.
Trump, how
nice
are
seeing you. Terrific.
Pleasure to meet you.
Terrific. You know Billy Bush?
How are you?
Nice to see you. How you doing, Ariane?
Notice their audio is good. We hear everything. You see, Trump and Billy Bush were mic'd before they arrived. So let's roll the tape back and listen to what they said before getting out to meet actress Ariane Zucker.
Geez, your girl's hot in the purple.
Whoa.
Yes.
Whoa.
Yes, the Donald has scored. Oh, my man. Wait, you gotta look at me when you get out of your leg.
Set this up. That is very.
You give me the thumbs
Look
up.
at you. You are a.
Thumbs up. You gotta get the thumbs up. Can't be too.
Yeah, that's it, with the gold. I gotta use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the. You can do anything.
They get off, shake hands, say hi, and...
Thank you. Are you ready to be a soap star?
We're ready. Let's go. Make me a soap star.
How about a little hug for the Donald? He just got off the
Is
bus.
it like a little hug,
Okay,
darling?
absolutely. Melania said this was okay.
So Trump supporters, but by the way, as far as method goes, I hope it's important to realize that visual culture is not all by itself. Audio culture is also important. If you're wearing a mic in the back room and start making jokes about somebody who you're about to meet, you might be aware of that. But it's as if Trump, he is like the classic psychotic in the sense that he has no unconscious. It's all out in the open. But this moment captures something he certainly didn't want to have captured. So his supporters shrugged off the vile boasting and behavior of their hero as nothing but locker room talk. Boys will be boys was the remark of women voters who went so far as to give permission to the Donald to grab them by the pussy. The best graphic critique of this episode was not really a caricature, not designed to produce laughter or scorn, but I think deep alarm and sadness. When 10 actual women came forward to accuse Trump of sexual harassment, his answer was predictably shameless. He noted that a former beauty queen who complained that he had groped her, he said, she's put on weight and is showing her age. Have you seen her? I don't think so. It was like almost a straightforward admission. Yes, I did grope her, or I wouldn't do it because she's not attractive enough. She doesn't deserve my attentions. P.T. Barnum, the godfather of American hucksters, put it very well when he noted that no one ever went broke underestimating the American public. He also remarked on how easy it is to bamboozle an emotionally vulnerable, poorly educated crowd with empty promises and hollow slogans. And his slogan for that was, in America, there's a sucker born every minute. And the right-wing destruction of the American system of public education has done its part to increase the birth rate of suckers. Abraham Lincoln had more faith in America. He said famously, you can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. But what Lincoln failed to notice was that these are actually very good odds for a gifted con man and demagogue who wants political power. Fooling some of the people some of the time is enough. So why didn't the experts see this coming? Why did the rational measurements fail so miserably? Perhaps it's because experts who work from rational premises using empirical data are in the worst possible position to understand the dynamics of an imminent psychotic break in collective psychology. They expect people who behave rationally as individuals to behave the same way as a collective. It's difficult for normal people to predict the behavior of a psychotic or to gauge what sort of messages will get through to someone in the grip of a delusion. And that's why psychoanalysis, with its dream of a talking cure, has generally been declared useless in treating schizophrenia. You can't talk to a psychotic. That's the Freudian view. There is no unconscious to be unearthed. The fantastic delusions and phobias aren't suppressed, but are right out in the open, just like these impotent caricatures of Donald Trump. Another thing that misled the experts is the tendency of people to lie about their motives when they're feeling ashamed. One of the best things we can say about Trump supporters is that, as with Brexit voters, they were fooled and didn't foresee the consequences of their actions. And lots of sadness, I think, in England now as people realize, wake up to what they did. If this were a case of individual madness, they could make an appeal based in a case of temporary insanity induced by a skillful psychologist. It was notable that despite the large crowds roaring their approval of Trump's absurdities, when they were interviewed in private, his supporters often became somewhat shy about their intentions to vote for Trump. Very few yard signs in America. The experts were predicting, after all, that he would lose, and who wants to admit they'll be voting for a loser? But in the voices of those who were willing to say publicly that they supported him, there was almost always the same equivocation. Well, I don't agree with much of what he says, but the formula repeats itself. I don't approve of his behavior with women, but, or I don't know how much he can accomplish, but, and the buts are invariably followed by a cliche. I like his policies, not his personality. Of course, nobody knew or really had any inkling of what his policies were, since they were nothing but slogans. Or, I think he'll bring change, and what have we got to lose? Or, he speaks his mind and is not a phony, which is true. He's not a phony. He's right out there in the open. Or, I like it that he's not politically correct by all those others. Or, he's not a politician, but a businessman, and we need a businessman to bring back our jobs. Look at the mess the politicians have made. Or, he will keep the government's hands off my guns. Or, he'll stop abortions. He'll be strong and tough. All these utterances are classic instances of what Freud called disavowal, the transparent denial of what's obvious to an objective observer. The most notorious version of this, of course, is the denial that one is a racist, whether it's anti-Semitism, negrophobia, or Islamophobia. As Jean-Paul Sartre noted long ago in Anti-Semite and Jew, one always hears the same formulation. I have nothing against the Jews, but there's just something about them. Often followed by, some of my best friends are Jews or Negroes, but just the same. Trump's great gift as a demagogue is the ability to say straight out what his followers can disavow and say, oh, it's only metaphoric. Or to make those coded utterances known as dog whistles that are inaudible to the human ear, but the dog hears them very well. So coded phrases such as crime in the cities are immediately recognizable as racially tinged. And overt statements, blatant lies such as Mexican immigrants are murderers and rapists and they're invading our country, reach directly to the hard right base, who welcome these uncoded remarks as signs of refreshing honesty and candor. Finally, they say, we have someone who's willing to stand up for white America. So is it fascism yet? I don't think so, not yet. But it is on the slippery slope, which leads to the corruption of the judiciary system, politicization of the military. The officer corps of the US military is already 90% Republicans. The persecution of minorities, the abrogation of civil rights, and the revocation of citizenship, for instance, for anybody who does something outrageous as an act of public speech. In The Mass Psychology of Fascism, Wilhelm Reich raised the question of why the communists and liberals did not see the rise of Hitler coming. Their economic class analysis had made it clear that Germany was ripe for socialism under the Weimar Republic. What went wrong? The answer, Reich says, they ignored the subjective factors. Again, it's important to be clear, it's not a question of calling Hitler a psychotic or labeling individual Germans as mentally deranged. Hitler may have been out of his mind, but he was perfectly capable of exploiting German engineering, science, and technology in the most rational ways to murder millions of people. So psychosis is not the same as irrationality. It's a much deeper syndrome, one which often puts reason to work. It's a disease of the soul or the personality, and it might be seen as an occupational hazard of sovereigns, those who have the power over life and death. Even a cautious, moderate soul like Barack Obama has found himself ordering the murder of American citizens. I mean, there's no way around it. And drone strikes that turn innocent civilians, including children, into collateral damage. A longing for power and its accompanying sense of powerlessness is the great vulnerability of populist movements, which often turn to the strong patriarchal leader who promises to address their grievances, destroy their enemies, and fulfill their fantasies of a return to a glorious past. So what lessons are to be learned and what's to be done? I want to emphasize first that there are important lessons for liberals and the Democratic Party in this defeat. The most important is to understand that the reactionary populism of what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables was not only racist, misogynist, or religious fanaticism. There was a subjective factor that united the large minority who voted for Trump, which he articulated with the claim, "The system is rigged." Indeed, this was probably the most potent single soundbite he ever uttered. And it's actually not that different from Barack Obama's anti-establishment populism in 2008. It reflected at the simplest level a rejection of the establishment in politics, in the financial system, and the world order defined by neoliberal globalization. I mean, isn't it an amazing paradox that someone like Trump, the most famous billionaire on the planet, was able to pass himself off as an anti-establishment candidate and a friend to the working man? I mean, it still just boggles the mind. But it was true, and that's why his own party, the Republican Party, hated him even more than despicable cynics like Ted Cruz. Strangest moment I've ever observed in my relatively long life. His anti-establishment views were shared by a significant number of Bernie Sanders voters. And I met a number of Trump supporters who said their second choice would have been Sanders, or that if he had won the nomination, they would have voted for him because of that system is rigged, that soundbite. A lot of people, in other words, there was a different kind of potential unity emerging in this moment. That was the kind of blending of Sanders and Trump. The neoliberal economic order has produced poverty and immiseration for the vast majority of the United States citizens and world populations. Unbridled capitalism hasn't just failed economically, it's also undermined the structure of democracy itself, which is why Bernie Sanders was very right to complain that the Democratic primary process had been rigged, manipulated to favor Hillary Clinton. We'll never know whether Sanders could have beaten Trump, but we do know that he would have presented a clear choice between Scandinavian-style socialism and Trump-style capitalism. Sanders could have peeled off millions of voters. It's too bad to miss that opportunity. So it was not so much, the election was not a repudiation of Obama so much as it was Clintonism, that third-way ideology of the 1990s that destroyed the American welfare state and helped to bring on the Great Recession of 2008. It wasn't just George W. Bush who deregulated the banks. The Clintons already did that. So the other thing that liberals and Democrats underestimated was the lingering sense that given her vote for the Iraq War, Clinton represented the strong likelihood of US involvement in another war in the Middle East. It's significant that Trump was able to cast himself as the peace candidate in this two-person race, portraying himself as having opposed the war in Iraq. Although this was a transparent lie, it had a clear purpose. One might have thought it risked weakening his strongman image, but he was able to compensate for that with his attacks on minorities and Muslims, and how he would get tough with terrorists and would be a torturer. So Trump portrayed a Fortress America image of foreign policy America first, last, and always. And this is why the neocons, the architects of the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, central to the old Republican establishment, were also appalled at Trump's candidacy and will probably play no role in his cabinet. They would have been happier with Hillary, whose adventurism in Libya was exactly the kind of thing they liked. So what is to be done again? Well, some like Slavoj Žižek says we can take delight in the possibility that Trump will exacerbate the contradictions so that the iron law of the dialectic will produce revolutionary class consciousness in the next 4 years. I don't think we should hold our breath waiting for that. But I do think liberalism has been exposed insofar as it thought to bank everything on identity politics and deluded itself into thinking that an uncharismatic white woman with the name Clinton could inherit the mantle of the fabulous orator and statesman Barack Obama, especially in a year when the simplest condensation of the issues was change versus continuity. Exactly the same dynamic that propelled Obama into office. Going forward, I think the challenge for the left and for liberals will be not to think there is an either-or choice between class and identity politics. Neither by itself is enough to produce a progressive turn. So is there a cure for the American psychosis? I think this is why we have science fiction movies that show aliens arriving from outer space who are a lot smarter than us, technically advanced. They say, okay, you know, you're a danger to yourselves, and you're certainly a danger to all the other living things on this planet. So we've come to take over. But that's a science fiction premise. If Nietzsche is correct, that collective insanity is the rule rather than the exception, it seems best to admit that Americans are suffering from an incurable condition, right alongside with the rest of the human species. Like Athens, the world's first democracy, the US is susceptible to takeovers by tyrants and oligarchs, and in Trump, we've managed to get both for the price of one. This is why, at the same time that the American left licks its wounds and strategizes for a comeback, it's going to be very important to play defense. The defense of liberal institutions, such as the American Constitution, the rule of law, the preservation of democratic forms, such as free and fair elections, perhaps even elections in which the majority wins, decent public education, and a vigilant free press, which the media is in great danger of being marginalized and excluded and drummed out of the White House. Every institution in the American government is now under attack. All of Trump's appointments to cabinet posts have been to persons who oppose the very existence and mission of the agency they're supposed to direct. The environment, energy policy, healthcare, education, labor. The guy who runs Hardee's restaurant chain is now going to be Secretary of Labor. He's against the minimum wage. He's against rules that say in an 8-hour shift, you ought to have a half hour for lunch. He says that's just, you know, how can you be a capitalist with rules like that? So the defense is going to have to be played. As for democracy, I think the only cure for a failing democracy like the US, unfortunately, is just more democracy. This is the historic lesson that I guess, I don't know, and this is a question I want to conclude with. It's about Switzerland, which in some ways is what the oldest democracy in Europe. I mean, I take it the old Swiss Confederacy started in 1291. So if our planet is indeed a ship of fools, an insane asylum where the inmates have to learn to treat themselves, is Switzerland the model? I thought so until I arrived a couple days ago. And then in the last 2 days, I've learned some things while being here that I want to share with you. The first thing I was told was that, that's my last image. Switzerland has been a neoliberal economy for a very long time, long before neoliberalism globalized itself. And by that I just mean unregulated, deregulated capitalism, which produces increasing inequality, wealth. But Switzerland has managed to make neoliberalism compatible with democracy in a very limited territory. So is Switzerland the model for the planet? Or is Switzerland itself a rogue state that stands outside of, that has made the neoliberal order work by making itself into a fortress, a gated community, where something that looks like formal democracy can go on? So I'm just going to leave you with that question. I really don't know the answer, but this seems like the right audience to ask that question of. So, thank you very much for your patience.